On January 2nd, 2007, Wesley Autry was taking his kids to school, and they stopped at the 137th Street subway station in Manhattan. At about 12:45, Wes noticed there was a man on the platform, the guy's name was Cameron Holopater, that was having a seizure. Wes found a pen from somebody and kept Cameron's mouth open, but unfortunately, Cameron fell from the platform onto the tracks of the subway. Now, as he lay on the tracks, Autry looked up the tunnel and saw an oncoming train. So he gave his two daughters to a woman to watch, and he jumped down onto the tracks in an effort to try to pull the man off of the tracks. But all of a sudden he realized it wasn't going to happen. The train was coming too fast. So he took the man, pushed him down into this trench between the tracks, and laid down on top of the man. The train conductor saw this happening, hit the emergency brake, but it wasn't fast enough, and the train went over both of the guys, and people were screaming. There was chaos. But from under the car, his daughters heard him say, "Please tell my kids I'm okay." The transit authority cut the power. They extricated the pair of the men, and Autry refused medical treatment, and he calmly took his kids to school. His only regret was that his hat got greasy. Autry was declared in the New York Times as the hero of Harlem, or the subway Superman. But when interviewed, he said, "I didn't feel like I did anything spectacular. I just saw someone who needed help, and I did what was right." Maybe the most appropriate title that Autry received after his act of courage was the Subway Samaritan. Now, I love those stories. I love hearing stories like that, especially these days where the worst of human nature seems to be trending news. I love the good stories. These stories should be commonplace, and I'll tell you why in a minute. And I'm not talking about just the big, courageous stories, but the little stories. Like I heard of this little boy. Somehow he came across a deer in his neighborhood that was blind. And so every morning he would get up, take this deer from one grassy patch to the other to make sure that the deer wouldn't die. Now, I'm telling you, whether they're huge stories or whether they're little stories like that, they should not just be a few. There shouldn't be more. There shouldn't be just dozens. There shouldn't be thousands. There should be billions of these stories, these Good Samaritan stories, constantly circulating around the world. Why? Because 2.2 billion people in this world claim to be followers of Jesus Christ. And Jesus made it crystal clear that these acts of selfless love and mercy are nothing short of a requirement for following him. Kind, loving actions focused on people in need are authenticators of your faith in Jesus. Courageous deeds done on behalf of others certify your claims of your surrender to Christ. Being a good Samaritan, listen to what I'm about to say. Being a good Samaritan is on par with reading your Bible. Being a good Samaritan is equally as important as praying and going to church and tithing. To quote the late Billy Graham, this is one of the rules of Christianity. Now, you think I'm exaggerating? Think I'm overselling this? Well, let's see what Jesus had to say about it. Grab a Bible and turn to Luke chapter 10, verse 25. Page 863. Under the Bible's under the seat in front of you, or open up your app and you can follow along the notes. I want to say hello to those of you who are watching online, especially those Grace people who are watching online and you're still somewhere where there's lots of sun and it's warm. So come home, but so help me, if you're dark tanned, I'm not going to be real happy with you because it's been cold while you've been gone. But anyway, seriously, be safe, get home, and we'll see you next weekend. All right, here we go. Let me remind you of the context of the series, first of all. Barry said this a little bit earlier, why we're doing this series. And to set it up, I want to remind you of something that Jesus said after he rose from the dead. He had gathered his followers and then on a mountain in Galilee, and he looked at them and he said this, "I have been given all authority in heaven and on earth." Now, I know this is not a real hard quiz, but how much authority had he been given? All the power, all the authority in the whole cosmos. Now, this phrase should get our attention. The fact that he now possesses, just a reminder, when he became a baby and walked for the first time as a human being, the scriptures tell us he set aside his authority and power for the time he walked as a human being. But when he rose from the dead, that power was given to him. All the power in the universe. Now, when we hear this, it should cause us to go back over Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John and put a filter over everything we have recorded that Jesus ever said. Because he has all authority, every word out of his mouth is like a truth sledgehammer. Every sermon, every illustration, every story that Jesus told has more weight than you've ever given it. And you probably ever will. We don't think this way, but I want you to understand that Jesus' stories are not just folksy. They're not just quaint parables. And they're not just rhetorically brilliant, but come on, Jesus was rhetorically brilliant. They're not those things as much as they are just mammoth. Mammoth stories. They are desperately crucial for right living. And we better know these stories, and we had better live these stories. So our preaching team has chosen 4 of Jesus' stories that we find intriguing and complicated and stunning. And today, I chose probably the most famous story Jesus ever told. I doubt that there are many people on this planet that haven't heard something about the Good Samaritan. Now, this story is a multi-layered story. In other words, you could approach this from a variety of angles, but I'm just going to center in on the moral of this particular story. I think that the moral comes out of 2 statements that Jesus made, one before he tells the story and one after he tells the story, that puts it in perspective. He looked at the man who asked him a question and he said this, "Do this and you will live." And then he tells the story and then he looks at the man again and says, "Go now and do the same." This is huge. If the Lord of all, the one who possesses all authority and power, have we talked about that? Jesus possessed, I think I've covered this with you, right? All the power in the universe, all of it. Now, when the one who has all that power looks at us and says, "Do this," well, hello, we should do it because it comes from Jesus. So, here's the moral of the story. I'm going to give you 2 ways of saying it. The first is this. An obvious mark of a real follower of Jesus is how well we love our neighbors. This is an obvious mark. This is a mark. You should be able, and I should be able to be assessed based on how we love our neighbors. But I'm going to put it in different words. This is the big idea of the morning. One of the clearest certifications of faith is your sacrificial love of a neighbor in need. This certifies your faith. So let's go back to the story. Let's walk through it from verse 25 on. So look down at the Bible. Ready? Here we go. Verse 25. One day, an expert in religious law stood up to test Jesus by asking him this question. "Teacher, what should I do to inherit eternal life?" Now let's stop right there. I want to point out something, that this man was not, I don't think he was sincerely asking this question. I think he was a jerk. I think he was a big old religious jerk. Because this is what the religious leaders, this was the games they would play. They loved to stand around and try to come up with the biggest law ever. Which is the biggest law in all of God's law? Or which law would get us to heaven faster? And I don't know this happened, but I could picture this religious ruler looking at his friends going, "Watch this. I'm going to ask him this question. He's going to blow it. He's going to get in trouble. Watch this." And so he asks him this question, and Jesus replies, look at verse 26. "What does the law of Moses say? How do you read it?" This is a clever reply from Jesus, putting it back on the man. And the man answered, "You must love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your strength and on all your mind." Now, let me stop right there because I have a sense that he decided to add this last thing from good measure. "And love your neighbor as yourself." Now, he got himself in trouble with that, and I'll show you how. Jesus replies, he says, Right. do this, what you just said, and you will live. Now, I think there was a bit of a pause in the story in verse 29 because the man, it says, wanted to justify his actions. So he asked Jesus, well, then tell me, who is my neighbor? He was found out. Not only was this guy a big religious jerk, but he had personal problems too. It's possible, we don't know this, it's possible that he was a bigot. It's possible that he was a racist because clearly he's struggling with, he said, this is part of the law, I got to love my neighbor as myself. But he realized he was doing a poor job of that. He was not loving his neighbor. And now he's got to find a way to justify himself because he's been found out. Maybe he was a guy who just didn't want to mess with people. Like I'm too important. I got things to do. I can't hang out. Maybe that was his problem. Maybe he just wanted to find a way to justify burying his head in religion without touching the lives of others. Whatever it was. That was the impetus of the story that Jesus invents. Jesus comes up with a story. This is brilliant. In the middle of a conversation, Jesus says, well, let me tell you a story. Here it is, verse 30. Jesus replied with a story. A Jewish man was traveling on a trip from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he was attacked by bandits. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him up, and left him half dead beside the road. Now, Jesus is telling the story, the crowd's around. Everybody, when he starts with this part of the story about a man going from Jerusalem to Jericho and gets beat, everyone's going, well, yeah, that makes sense because that was a dangerous highway. If you walked by yourself, you took your life in your own hands. Clearly in the story, the man did. Bandits attack him. He gets beaten up. He's on the side of the road. Verse 31 is where the heat in the room suddenly gets higher because Jesus says, by chance, a priest came along. But when he saw the man lying there, he crossed to the other side of the road, didn't want to have anything to do with him, passed him by. And then a temple assistant, that's like the associate pastor. If the priest was the pastor, the temple assistant was like the associate pastor, right? Walked over, looked at the man lying there. He also passed by on the other side. Now, why did Jesus include a priest and a Levite or a religious leader? Why did he include him in his story? Because they were standing right there. There was Jesus talking to a bunch of them, so he wants to make a point about these religious leaders, and so he includes them in the story. Let's just imagine this. When he says a priest and a Levite, everybody around is going, uh-oh. Uh-oh. And the tension is rising. So that's one of the reasons. The second reason he may have included a priest and Levite was there is a possibility in Jesus' storytelling that the priest and the Levite did not want to get near this man because there was a big law that said you never are to get near or touch dead bodies. They might have presumed that this guy was dead or going to be dead, and they didn't want to be caught violating the law. And this whole business of doing something good for somebody who had a need, when the law suggested you shouldn't, this was a constant battle between Jesus and the Pharisees. Like, for example, he was always under fire because he healed. He did a great thing. Jesus would heal a guy on the Sabbath, and the priest would go, how could you do that? It's the Sabbath. And Jesus said, I healed a guy. What do you mean? He's healed. That's maybe what was happening here as well. It might be that they were representing how the law can transcend mercy and love, and Jesus wants to point that out. Or maybe he just chose them because they were important, busy people who had places to go and things to do. And when you have places to go, we're going to come back to this in a minute. When you got places to go and things to do, and you have an agenda, stopping to help a dude that is hurt is not at the top of the agenda. So already the heat is up. Jesus has included these guys in the story, and then there's a plot twist. And if it was hot in the room then, it became rage-filled when he said, look at verse 31. Then a despised Samaritan, even just uttering that name in that crowd would have gotten him in serious trouble. A despised Samaritan comes along. When he sees the man, he feels compassion for him. Going over to him, the Samaritan soothed his wounds with olive oil and wine, and he bandaged them. Then he put the man on his own donkey and took him to an inn where he took care of him. The next day, he handed the innkeeper 2 silver coins, and he says, look, take care of this man. If the bill runs higher than this, I'll pay you the next time I'm here. All right, so the inclusion of the Samaritan was hugely problematic, and I need to tell you why. Many of you know why, what the significance. The Samaritan was I should tell you that it was a part Jewish, part pagan. They lived among Jews, but Samaritans were segregated from Jews, and they hated each other. Why? Well, here's the story. 700 years before this moment of the storytelling of the Good Samaritan, 700 years, the nation of Assyria invaded the northern kingdom of Israel. And they did what they always did when they would take over a country. They would find the elite among the population, those who were rulers, those who were educated, those who were wealthy, and they would gather them all and ship them out. They would steal them and send them back to Assyria. They would leave behind a few people, but not the leaders and not the people of money. They just left them to make do for themselves. And then they would go one step further. The Assyrians would go to, say, another country they'd conquered, and they'd take some of the people from there, and they would actually resettle them among the people that were left behind in over 10, 20, 30, 40, 100 years, 200 years. Those two different people groups would start to intermingle, and have these families, and that were essentially half-breeds. They were part Jewish, part pagan. So that was happening over a 200-year period of time. 200 years after the exiles are sent away, Babylon decides to send them back. Now, it's 200 years, so it's not the exact same people that were carried away into exile, but it's their families. They're sent back. So they go back to Israel, and the Samaritans are waiting, and they're we're so glad to see you. And they really were. We're Jews. We're all Jews, right? So we'll rebuild the temple together, and so we can start living together. And the Jewish people are like, no. I'm not going to have anything. You guys are half-breeds. What? We worship the same God. We do not. You are perverted in your religion. And that's when it all broke between the Jewish nation and the Samaritans. And decade after century, it just got worse and worse to the point. And I should tell you, the Samaritans moved kind of the northern part of Israel, and they formed their own cultic center there. Never intermingled. To the point in Jesus' day where a Samaritan would look at a Jew, and a Jew would look at a Samaritan and feel like each other were the scum of the planet. That they were actually non-human. They hated each other that much. So do you understand now when Jesus says, and along comes a Samaritan? This is huge. Now, I wrestled with trying to come up with a modern day equivalent of this hatred between Samaritans and Jews. So I had a couple illustrations for you. One is this. Let's pretend that Jesus told this story not in first century Israel, but in 19th century America, in the mid-1800s. Here's what he might have done if he was telling the story in 1840 or 1850. He was among a crowd of plantation owners. And the plantation owners were the one of their own got beat up on the road. But who came, and plantation owner after plantation owner walked by, didn't want to help him. But the guy who comes and helps him was an escaped slave. You see what that would feel like? Or you couldn't even flip the script and say the people, the crowd that Jesus was talking to were escaped slaves, and the Samaritan was a plantation owner. Let me give another illustration. Let's fast forward. If Jesus was standing in 1930s Eastern Europe, and he's telling this story to the crowd, picture the crowd being a bunch of Nazis, and the Good Samaritan, a concentration camp survivor, Jewish concentration camp survivor. Or flip the script, that the crowd was the concentration camp survivors and the Samaritan was a Nazi. I'm telling you how complicated this was and how people would have hated this illustration. So 2 days ago, I had on my notes, I was actually going to try to come up with a 2018 analogy. I had a bunch of illustrations, and I deleted them all. And decided I was going to do this instead. I'm going to ask you to use your imagination. I want you to imagine that you're in the crowd, and Jesus is telling the story to you. And the Samaritan that comes along is a person with whom you think is scum. Now, who are you thinking? What does he or she look like? Who is scum to you? Imagine how you would feel if the scum of the earth was the one who entered in your life to bring healing. And you get an idea of how they felt when Jesus told this story. We get to the end of the story and Jesus looks at the man. Look at verse 36. Looks at the man and says, now which of these three, the priest, the Levite, or the Samaritan, which of these three was a neighbor to the man who was attacked by the bandits? And the man replies, and I think this was probably with some tension, the one who showed him mercy. And then you can't tell because in the verb tenses of this last phrase of Jesus, it would literally would sound like this. Jesus actually looked at the man in the eyes and said, you, sir, yes, you're right. Now you, sir, go and do the same. So the meat of this story lies in the practical description of mercy and sacrificial love that this man displayed. It's just not hard. You can read into the story and we can break it down. What exactly did the Samaritan do that was full of mercy? And I'm going to suggest, I have about 8 items, things that I think the Samaritan did. Watch this. The first thing he did that was amazing was that he paid attention. So he's walking on, made up story, but he's walking on this road and he actually sees a man in need. He paid attention. He saw it. Now, that may not seem like a really big deal, but consider the fact that you and I barely pay attention to what's happening around us. We barely do. We don't see needs. We just don't because we don't pay attention. Let me tell you about, a little self-disclosure. I'm an A to B kind of guy. If I'm at A, I'm getting to B. And you don't get my way because I've got to get from here to there. That's my life. Whether it's driving or doing work or whatever it is, and some of you are like me. As a result of being like me, you don't see what's going around you. It's like you have these big blinders on and we can't see the needs of people because we're simply not paying attention. This man paid attention. And then he felt compassion when he saw what he saw. I have a feeling that if we started to pay attention, we actually might have more compassion than we think. If we just looked. Second thing the man did, it was clear in the story, is he placed himself in danger. You don't stop and help a guy on a bandit-infested road. But he did. He was not risk-averse. We are terribly risk-averse. This describes the United States of America. We are scared all the time. And we will do anything to stay away from any kind of risk. And if that means putting my blinders on and walking by a person in obvious need, I will do that because I don't want to risk it. This man did. Third thing he did what was gross and nasty. There was like blood coming out of this guy. He was a mess. It kind of makes me squeamish to think of. Does it make you squeamish to think about it? And as I was considering the fact that this man was willing to do the gross work and the nasty work, I just realized the people in our lives who are always willing to do this all the time. Physicians, nurses, aides, EMTs, paramedics, first responders are always there and they're willing to do the nasty thing. So this is just a side. Would you do me a favor and would you right now thank by applause those kind of people in our life? Would you thank them? Thank you. Thank you for loving us so well and being willing to do the nasty stuff for our benefit. The other thing this man did was that he was tender. Now, dudes, listen to me. We're terrible at this. We are not tender creatures. He was. You need to be. Get the male chip off your shoulder and be tender. We will heal people if we learn how to be tender. The other thing this guy gave was the single greatest possession of an American. There is something more important to us than anything else in this world. And no, it's not money. What did he give this guy? Time. Time. He's willing to stop his whole life and give this man time. Fact is, look at your life. I'll bet you don't have a 5-minute cushion anywhere in a typical day. Right? We don't have that kind of cushion, which means caring for somebody is a luxury. He gave him time. Would you be able to interrupt your day? Would you be able to do that so that you can invest in somebody in need? Or do you have places to go and people to see? He gave time. This is hard because you live every day with this barely 5-minute, this cushion. You got to get your child to soccer. You got to go to the store. He gave him time. Another thing he offered was personal property. I think he probably put the guy on his donkey and thought, well, that donkey will never be the same again. Of course, he gave money. We know that. But this business of him stopping what he was doing, taking the guy into an inn, staying with the guy, cleaning him up, and then saying to the innkeeper, I'm coming back. I'll be back. Here's 2 coins to tide him over. If he needs more, I'll give you more money when I come back. I'll be back. You know what this Samaritan did? This is so... This points out our lives in a crystal clear way. You have a to-do list, don't you? Like I've got a to-do list of to-do lists. I literally have a to-do list category, and I draw from the to-do list categories to create my to-do list. And I bet you I don't know how many hours I spend on managing my to-do list. And on the right, some of you write things down to check them off, right? So I get that. This Samaritan took this man who's hurting, and he made this man the top of his to-do list. Could you, in an act of compassion and mercy, reorient your life to create a new to-do list that at the top of the list was somebody who had need? That is something we just don't do. We don't give our time. He gave him his full attention. It's extraordinary. That is mercy. That is love. And that is Christian faith in action. One of the clearest certifications of faith is your sacrificial love of a neighbor in need. So, what does mercy and sacrifice look like in 2018? Who are the broken people in your life that you pass by? Who is the other to you? What does it mean to interrupt your life for another? The need for the 2.2 billion of us in this world to be Good Samaritans has never been greater. On April 18th of 2010, Guatemalan immigrant Hugo Alfredo Talayax came to the aid of a woman. It was in Queens, New York. A woman was being threatened by a man who had a knife. Hugo intervened, struggled with the attacker, but he was eventually stabbed and left to die on the street. The woman ran away. The attacker fled in a different direction while Hugo laid there and bled. Video surveillance caught the whole thing. They showed that the first person who came up to him didn't help him. He took a picture on his cell phone and walked away. 18 other people walked by or nearby and passed right by him without offering any help at all. The closest anyone came to helping was a man who walked over and shook Hugo's body, but when he saw the blood, he took off. Firefighters arrived 15 minutes later, but by then, it was too late. Hugo had died. There are 2.2 billion of us in this world, those of us who claim to follow Jesus. These stories, by sheer number, should never happen ever again.